The grand arena of Thakar Prime was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure, a vast space where the greatest warriors of an entire civilization gathered to witness displays of martial excellence and strategic brilliance. The architecture soared upward in impossible curves, surfaces crafted from materials that absorbed sound in some areas and amplified it in others, creating acoustic zones that let the Queen's voice carry to thousands without technological assistance. Marcus Chen stood on the arena floor trying very hard to look like he belonged there, and not like a lost xenoanthropologist who'd taken a catastrophically wrong turn on his way to the research archives. This was not going according to plan. To be fair, Marcus's plan had been fairly simple. Attend the ceremonial gathering from the designated scholars gallery, take notes on social dynamics and ritual structures, return to his quarters to write up observations for his dissertation on Thakarian warrior culture. At no point had the plan included accidentally end up on the arena floor during what appears to be an extremely important royal announcement. But here he was anyway because the palace architecture made absolutely no sense to human spatial reasoning, and he'd arrived late after a morning spent deep in historical texts about succession protocols. The late arrival meant he'd missed the formal procession. The crowds had already filled the proper viewing areas, and a helpful palace attendant had directed him through what seemed like a shortcut but was apparently a route reserved for participants rather than observers. Marcus had realized his error approximately 30 seconds ago, right as Queen Vorana the Unconquered began speaking, and every single person in the arena turned their attention to the floor where he was now standing, alone, very visibly alone. The Thakarians were an imposing species by any standard. They averaged 7 to 8 feet in height, their frames built for power and endurance with musculature that made human bodybuilders look like they'd skipped every gym day. Their society was built entirely around martial excellence. Not because they were violent or aggressive by nature, but because their homeworld had been hostile enough that only the strongest and most strategically brilliant survived to develop civilization. That evolutionary pressure had created a culture that valued combat skill, strategic thinking, and genetic legacy above almost everything else. Marcus had been studying them for 3 months now, carefully observing from academic distance, taking notes on social structures, political dynamics, and the complex honor systems that governed interactions. He knew enough to understand that being on the arena floor right now was a significant breach of protocol. He just didn't know enough to understand exactly how significant or what the consequences might be. Queen Vorana stood on the royal platform overlooking the arena, a figure that commanded attention through sheer presence rather than any need for dramatic staging. She was tall even by Thakarian standards, her frame suggesting both power and precision, her bearing that of someone who'd earned authority through demonstrated capability, rather than inherited it through accident of birth. Well, she had inherited it initially, but Thakarian monarchy required proving yourself worthy, through trials that killed approximately 30% of royal heirs before they could claim the throne. She'd survived and thrived, which was why she'd ruled for 40 years, and showed no signs of slowing down. Her voice carried across the arena with perfect clarity, speaking in formal Thakarian that Marcus's language training let him understand, despite the archaic phrasing. She was addressing the assembled warriors, thousands of the finest fighters their species had produced, and her message was becoming increasingly clear and increasingly uncomfortable. The Queen's 3 daughters were unmatched warriors. Curavel the strategist had never lost a military campaign. Zoranese the Unconquerable had never been defeated in personal combat. Lyrazan the Wise was the youngest master philosopher warrior in Thakarian history. They were perfection by their culture's standards, the absolute peak of what their genetics and training could produce, and apparently, no male of their species was brave enough to approach them as potential mates. Queen Vorana's tone made it clear this was not a point of pride. Thakarian genetics required strong partners to produce strong offspring. Their selection process involved combat trials and strategic testing, ensuring genetic lines remained capable and excellent. But her daughter's excellence had become intimidating rather than attractive. Males approached with either arrogance, assuming they could defeat the princesses and prove superiority, or with such excessive deference that they treated the women as untouchable rather than as potential partners. The arrogant ones got destroyed in trials and retreated in shame. The deferential ones never tried at all. The result was a genetic problem threatening the royal bloodline. Without suitable mates demonstrating genuine courage and compatible strength, the next generation would suffer. The Queen's voice rose with challenge and frustration. Is there no one brave enough to give me strong grandchildren? No warrior among all assembled who will face my daughters with courage and genuine spirit, rather than arrogance or cowardice? The silence that followed was absolute and profoundly uncomfortable. Marcus watched thousands of elite Thicarian warriors, any one of whom could probably break him in half without effort, stand completely frozen. No one moved, no one spoke. The atmosphere grew heavy with collective shame because this was a direct challenge from their queen, and not one person was answering. Marcus understood intellectually why no one was stepping forward. Approaching the royal daughters wasn't just about courage in abstract sense. It meant being willing to face the most dangerous women on the planet in combat trials, to match them strategically and philosophically, to demonstrate worthiness while knowing they'd already defeated everyone who tried before. It meant risking public humiliation if you failed, but also risking public judgment if you approached with anything less than genuine respect and compatibility. The social complexity was paralyzing thousands of warriors into inaction. He understood all of this academically from his research. What he didn't understand was why everyone was suddenly staring at him. It took his brain several seconds to process what his position on the arena floor actually meant. In Thicarian ceremony, the arena floor was challenge space. You stood there if you were issuing challenges or accepting them. Observers and non-participants stayed in the elevated galleries and platforms surrounding the floor. Marcus had accidentally positioned himself the one location that signaled he was answering the Queen's question. Through catastrophic timing and architectural confusion, he appeared to be volunteering. Every warrior in the vast arena was now looking at the lone human standing in challenge space. Some expressions showed confusion. Why was a human even present? Some showed amusement. Surely this was a mistake that would be quickly corrected. Some showed something that might have been respect for either bravery or spectacular stupidity. It was hard to tell which. Queen Varana's gaze focused on Marcus with the intensity of a targeting laser acquiring its objective. Her eyes were sharp and calculating, taking in his human frame, his significantly smaller stature compared to Thicarian males, his obvious non-warrior status based on the scholar's clothing he wore. The formal robes marked him clearly as an academic observer, someone present for research rather than participation, someone who had absolutely no business standing in challenge space. Marcus's brain screamed at him to explain the misunderstanding, to apologize profusely, to clarify that he was just a lost researcher who'd taken a wrong turn. His mouth opened to deliver exactly that explanation. What came out instead was something completely different, delivered in perfectly grammatical Thicarian that he'd spent 3 months learning. "I'm brave enough." The arena erupted, not in applause or approval, but in shock, so profound it manifested as sound. Thousands of warriors simultaneously making noises of disbelief, confusion, and what might have been impressed horror at his sheer audacity. Thicarian warriors turned to each other, their expressions cycling rapidly through multiple emotions. Some looked amused, clearly expecting this presumptuous human to be quickly dismissed. Some looked intrigued, wondering what would happen next. A few looked at Marcus with something that might have been respect for demonstrating courage, even if he was demonstrating it while being catastrophically out of his depth. The Queen's 3 daughters, who had been standing on an elevated platform behind their mother looking bored and disappointed by the ceremony's failure, suddenly looked very interested. All 3 focused on Marcus, with attention that made him acutely aware of exactly how much danger he just put himself in, through what might have been the worst case of verbal autopilot in academic history. Queen Varana studied him in silence, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. Her expression was unreadable by Marcus's limited experience with Thicarian body language. She could be preparing to laugh at him. She could be preparing to have him removed from the arena. She could be preparing to let her daughters demonstrate exactly why no one had been brave enough to approach them. When she finally spoke, her voice carried clearly across the arena despite normal volume. "You are human." It wasn't a question, but Marcus nodded anyway, because his mouth had apparently decided to stop consulting his brain before engaging. "Yes, Your Majesty." Dr. Marcus Chen, xenoanthropology researcher on Cultural Exchange Program, currently studying Thicarian social structures for my dissertation, and I appear to have taken a very wrong turn on my way to the archives. The Queen's expression might have shifted slightly toward amusement, but Marcus couldn't be certain. "You are significantly smaller than our males. Your species is not known for martial prowess or physical strength. You lack the capabilities our genetics typically require for producing strong offspring. You are, by every traditional measure, unsuitable for approaching my daughters." She paused, and her eyes remained fixed on Marcus with that same calculating intensity. "Yet you claim bravery sufficient to face them." Marcus's survival instincts were screaming at him to back down, apologize, retreat to safety while he still could. His academic training suggested this was an excellent opportunity to discuss cultural misunderstandings and proper diplomatic protocols. But some other part of him, maybe the part that had gotten him through his PhD defense when his entire committee tried to destroy his thesis, maybe the part that had volunteered for frontier research postings because safe academic positions were boring, maybe just the part that really hated backing down once he'd committed to something, refused to retreat. "Bravery isn't about size or physical strength," Marcus said, keeping his voice as steady as possible while his heart tried to escape his chest through percussive force. "It's about being willing to face challenges despite being afraid. And I am definitely afraid right now, Your Majesty, but I'm still standing here." The arena's noise level dropped back to absolute silence as everyone waited to see how the Queen would respond to this small human's continued defiance of every reasonable expectation. Queen Varana descended from her platform with predatory grace, moving across the arena floor with the kind of fluid power that reminded Marcus exactly how dangerous she was. She'd earned her title, the Unconquered, through 40 years of never losing a single combat trial, never making a strategic error that cost her forces, never showing weakness that rivals could exploit. She was a living legend, and she was now walking directly toward Marcus with an expression he definitely could not interpret accurately. The height difference when she reached him was significant. Queen Varana stood easily 2 feet taller, her frame built for power and combat in ways human biology had never managed. Standing this close, Marcus could see details his research observations had missed. The patterns of scars on her arms that told stories of specific battles, the way she moved with absolute confidence in her physical capabilities, the intelligence in her eyes that suggested her reputation for strategic brilliance wasn't exaggerated. She circled him slowly, evaluating him the way a predator considers prey that has behaved unexpectedly. The entire court watched in fascinated silence, waiting to see what their queen would do with this bizarre situation that had somehow manifested in their ceremonial arena. "You speak our language well," she observed, switching to a more complex dialect that most translators struggled with. "Where did you learn?" 3 months of intensive study and immersion," Marcus answered in the same dialect, grateful his linguistic training was at least keeping up with the situation. "Your language structure is fascinating. The way tactical precision and honor concepts are embedded in grammar itself tells you so much about cultural values. You study us. I study many cultures, Your Majesty, but yours has been particularly interesting. The way you've built an entire civilization around martial excellence, while maintaining philosophical depth and strategic sophistication. It's remarkable. Most warrior cultures sacrifice one for the other. Thicarians integrate all three." The Queen's expression definitely shifted toward interest now. "You understand our values." "I try to. Understanding is why I'm here, why I volunteered for this research posting." Marcus knew he should stop talking, but his academic enthusiasm was overriding his survival instincts. "Your society fascinates me precisely because you've solved problems my species still struggles with. How to value strength without glorifying violence, how to maintain honor without rigidity, how to select for genetic excellence without becoming eugenicist. You've achieved balance that humans find very difficult." Queen Varana stopped circling and stood directly in front of him again. "And yet, you claim bravery to approach my daughters despite understanding exactly how outmatched you are by every physical standard. Because I also understand that Thicarian values include more than just physical capability," Marcus said, which was possibly the most academic way anyone had ever defended their accidental volunteer status. "Your trials test courage, intelligence, and spirit, not just strength. Those are qualities humans can possess, even if we're smaller and weaker." The Queen studied him for another long moment, then made a decision with the kind of decisive authority Marcus had learned characterized Thicarian leadership. She turned to address the assembled court, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast arena. "This human stands in challenge space, claiming bravery sufficient to approach my daughters. He is small, weak by our standards, lacking the physical capabilities our genetics typically require. By traditional measures, he should be dismissed immediately." She paused, and the arena held its collective breath. But he demonstrates something that none of our own warriors have shown today. He acknowledges his fear openly while refusing to retreat. He understands our values deeply enough to articulate them better than many natives. He speaks of courage as action despite fear, rather than absence of fear. The Queen's gaze swept across the thousands of assembled warriors. Perhaps this is exactly what our bloodline needs. Not more warriors who are too arrogant to acknowledge their limitations or too intimidated to try, but someone who faces impossible odds with clear eyes and refuses to back down. She turned back to Marcus, and her expression held something that might have been approval or might have been dangerous curiosity. I will not simply accept or reject your challenge, human. That would be too simple and would teach us nothing. Instead, I will test you. Not to see if you can defeat my daughters in combat. That would be pointless given your species' limitations, but to discover why you refuse to back down, what qualities you possess that might explain apparent courage or spectacular foolishness. The Queen gestured toward her 3 daughters, who descended from their platform with synchronized grace that spoke to years of training together. Up close, they were even more intimidating than Marcus's research observations had suggested. Curavel was the eldest, her bearing suggesting military command and strategic calculation. Her eyes assessed Marcus the way a general evaluates battlefield terrain, looking for advantages and weaknesses. She was the one who'd never lost a military campaign, whose tactical brilliance was studied across multiple star systems as example of perfect strategic thinking. Zoranese was the middle daughter, and her presence radiated controlled violence in ways that made Marcus's hindbrain scream warnings about proximity to apex predators. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been defeated in personal combat, who'd faced thousands of opponents, and emerged victorious from every single encounter. Her reputation suggested she wasn't cruel or sadistic. She simply won always with such consistency that challenging her seemed futile. Lyrazan was the youngest, and paradoxically the most unsettling to Marcus's academic mind. She looked at him with philosophical interest rather than tactical assessment, like he was a fascinating puzzle rather than a potential opponent. She was the philosopher warrior, the one who'd mastered both martial excellence and deep theoretical thinking about what it all meant. Her trials, according to Marcus's research, tested character and spirit rather than simple combat capability. You will face 3 trials, Queen Vorana announced, her voice carrying formally for the court's benefit. 1 overseen by each daughter. The trials will test courage, intelligence, and strength of spirit. Not to see if you can win by our standards, you cannot, but to see whether you possess qualities worth considering for our bloodline despite your physical limitations. She moved closer, lowering her voice so only Marcus could hear. This is your opportunity to retreat with honor, human. You stumbled into this situation by accident. No shame attaches to acknowledging error and withdrawing. My daughter's trials are designed to break warriors much stronger than you. They will not be gentle simply because you are small and weak. Marcus's brain and survival instincts were both screaming at him to take the offered exit, to apologize and retreat while he still could. This was his chance to return to safe academic observation, to write about this experience from comfortable distance rather than participating in it personally. He opened his mouth to accept the graceful retreat. What came out was, "I accept the trials, Your Majesty." The Queen's expression definitely showed approval now, mixed with something that might have been concern. Courage or foolishness, we will discover which. Begin tomorrow at dawn. Tonight, you may prepare yourself and contemplate whether you truly wish to proceed. She turned and walked back toward her platform, her daughters following with one last evaluative look at Marcus that suggested they were already planning how to test this presumptuous human who'd accidentally volunteered for the impossible. The court began dispersing with hundreds of conversations erupting simultaneously, everyone discussing the unprecedented situation that had just unfolded. Marcus stood alone on the arena floor, trying to process what he just agreed to, wondering if his dissertation committee would accept, "I got tested for genetic worthiness by alien warrior princesses because I can't follow simple directions as a valid research methodology." A palace attendant approached with the kind of careful politeness that suggested they weren't quite sure how to address someone who just done something this unprecedented. "Dr. Chen, I'm to escort you to guest quarters in the royal wing. The Queen has ordered appropriate accommodations and access to preparation resources." "Preparation resources?" Marcus asked, following the attendant through corridors he definitely didn't recognize from his previous 3 months of research. What kind of preparation helps with facing warrior princesses in trials designed to break people much stronger than me? Traditionally, prayer and meditation, the attendant said with what might have been sympathy, though in your case, perhaps reviewing any human strategies for surviving encounters with superior opponents. The trials begin at dawn. You have approximately 14 hours to prepare yourself mentally and physically for what Princess Caravel has planned. What has she planned? I don't know specifically, but she's never lost a strategic scenario, and she has a reputation for designing trials that test every cognitive capability simultaneously. Warriors who face her trials describe them as mentally exhausting even when they succeed. The attendant paused at an ornate door. These are your quarters. Food will be provided if you wish it, though many warriors prefer to fast before trials. The Queen requests your presence at evening meal in 3 hours, if you feel capable of social interaction. Marcus entered quarters that were significantly nicer than his research housing, clearly designed for important guests rather than visiting academics. He sat on furniture scaled for Thicarian proportions and tried to organize his thoughts into something resembling coherent analysis. He just committed to facing 3 trials designed by warrior princesses who'd never been defeated, testing qualities he wasn't sure he possessed for the purpose of determining whether human courage could compensate for human physical limitations in genetic partnership. His dissertation was supposed to be about Thicarian social structures from safe observational distance. Instead, he was apparently participating in royal succession dynamics while trying not to die of either physical trauma or sheer mortification. His advisor was going to have so many questions. Actually, his advisor was probably going to demand he write an entirely different dissertation about this experience, assuming he survived to write anything at all. Marcus pulled out his research tablet and began reviewing everything he knew about the Queen's daughters, their reputations, their trial methodologies. If he was doing this, and apparently he was, because his mouth had committed him beyond any reasonable retreat, he was going to approach it with every advantage his academic training could provide. Caravel tested strategic thinking and tactical intelligence. Her trials involved warfare simulations, resource management under pressure, and the ability to adapt plans when situations changed unexpectedly. Warriors who faced her trials described them as mentally exhausting chess matches where every move had consequences, and she was always thinking 7 steps ahead. Zorani's tested courage through direct confrontation with fear and pain. Her trials involved combat scenarios designed to push warriors to their absolute limits, forcing them to continue fighting even when every instinct screamed to surrender. She didn't require victory. She required persistence, despite knowing you were going to lose. Lyrazen tested spirit and character through philosophical challenges and moral dilemmas. Her trials were less physical and more psychological, exploring what you believed and why, testing whether your principles survived under pressure. Warriors found her trials the most disturbing because they revealed truths about themselves they'd been avoiding. Marcus had approximately 14 hours to prepare for all 3, knowing he was going to fail by traditional Thicarian standards, but hoping he could fail in ways that demonstrated the qualities Queen Varana claimed to value. Courage despite fear, intelligence in the face of superior opponents, spirit that refused to break even when breaking would be reasonable. He started making notes, organizing his thoughts, approaching the problem the way he'd approach any research challenge. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it properly. Outside his quarters, the palace buzzed with speculation about the human who'd either demonstrated unprecedented courage or unprecedented stupidity. In the royal wing, 3 warrior princesses were planning trials for the first person brave enough or foolish enough to actually accept their mother's challenge. And in the throne room, Queen Varana contemplated whether she just discovered exactly what her bloodline needed, or whether she just subjected a well-meaning academic to an experience that would traumatize him for life. Time would tell. The trials began at dawn. Marcus spent his 14 hours preparing as best he could, which mostly meant reviewing everything he knew about asymmetric warfare, human military history, and the philosophy of courage in the face of impossible odds. He attended the evening meal where he was seated near the royal family and subjected to polite interrogation from various court officials who wanted to understand what this human thought he was doing. He answered honestly. He'd taken a wrong turn, committed accidentally, and refused to back down, because backing down felt worse than facing the trials. That honesty seemed to earn him a certain amount of respect, or at least made people stop assuming he was running some kind of elaborate scheme. Queen Varana watched these interactions with interest, occasionally asking questions that suggested she was already evaluating his character beyond what the formal trials would reveal. By the time Marcus returned to his quarters to attempt sleep before dawn trials, he'd accepted that this was actually happening, and there was no graceful exit available. So, he was going to face it with as much courage and intelligence as he could manage, knowing he'd probably fail, but determined to fail well. Dawn came too quickly. Marcus was escorted back to the arena, which had been reconfigured into a tactical command center, with holographic displays and strategic simulation equipment. Princess Caravel stood in the center, looking exactly like someone who'd never lost a military campaign and knew she wasn't about to start now. "Dr. Chen," she said formally, "welcome to your first trial. I will test your strategic thinking and tactical adaptation. You will face 3 military scenarios of increasing complexity. I do not expect you to win by traditional measures. You lack the combat knowledge our warriors spend decades acquiring, but I will evaluate how you think, how you adapt, and whether your intelligence survives under pressure." She gestured to the simulation equipment. "Begin when ready. Fail with honor or succeed against expectations. Either way, I will learn what I need to know about your worth." Marcus took his position at the command display, looked at the impossible scenario arrayed before him, and began doing what academics do best, thinking creatively about problems everyone else assumed had only one solution. The trials had begun, and Marcus Chen was about to discover whether human ingenuity could compensate for human physical limitations when facing the greatest warriors an entire civilization had produced. The first scenario Caravel presented looked like a tactical nightmare designed specifically to destroy whoever was foolish enough to attempt commanding through it. Marcus studied the holographic display showing terrain, force distributions, and objective parameters, while trying to ignore the fact that he was being evaluated by someone whose military genius was studied across multiple star systems. He commanded simulated forces approximately 1/3 the size of the opposing army. Terrain disadvantage was severe. His forces occupied lower ground with limited defensive positions. Supply lines were overextended and vulnerable to interdiction. Enemy forces were positioned to exploit every possible weakness. Victory conditions required capturing a fortified position defended by numerically superior opponents, with better equipment and tactical positioning. By conventional military analysis, this scenario was unwinnable. The proper response would be to minimize losses while achieving whatever secondary objectives remained accessible, then retreat in good order. Marcus spent 60 seconds studying the scenario parameters, then asked his first question: "Are there time constraints on engagement?" Caravel raised one eyebrow slightly. A Thicarian expression Marcus had learned indicated interested surprise. "Standard campaign duration, 30 days simulated time." "Why?" "Because conventional assault fails," Marcus said, already manipulating the display to explore alternative approaches. "Direct confrontation with numerical and tactical disadvantage guarantees defeat. But asymmetric warfare isn't about winning through superior force. It's about changing the victory conditions until the enemy's advantages become irrelevant." He began issuing commands to his simulated forces, and Caravel moved closer to watch his approach with focused attention. Instead of massing for assault, Marcus dispersed his forces into small units. Instead of attacking the fortified position directly, he began targeting supply lines, communication networks, and the infrastructure supporting the enemy's numerical advantage. He used mobility to offset positional disadvantage, avoiding direct engagement, while systematically degrading the enemy's operational capability. "You're not fighting," Caravel observed after 10 minutes of simulation time. "You're eroding." "I'm fighting. Just not the battle your scenario assumed I'd fight," Marcus replied, tracking multiple small engagements across the tactical display. "My forces can't win head-to-head confrontation. So I'm not having head-to-head confrontations. I'm making the enemy expend resources defending everything simultaneously, while I attack nothing directly. Eventually, their superior numbers become a logistics problem rather than an advantage." The scenario ran forward with Caravel watching in silence. Marcus's forces never captured the fortified objective through direct assault. Instead, they made holding that objective increasingly untenable by destroying everything supporting it. When the 30-day simulation concluded, the enemy technically still held the fortified position, but they held it with forces that were exhausted, undersupplied, demoralized, and surrounded by hostile territory, where every supply convoy required major military escort. "You didn't win," Caravel said, but her tone wasn't disappointed. "You didn't achieve the stated objective." "I achieved a different objective," Marcus countered. "The enemy holds one fortified position at enormous cost, while I control everything around it. In practical terms, I've won the campaign, even though I technically lost the battle. That's asymmetric warfare. Redefine victory conditions until you're fighting a war you can actually win." Caravel's expression suggested she was re-evaluating her initial assessment. Human military philosophy, partially. Also, game theory, economic warfare principles, and historical examples from species that survived first contact with technologically superior opponents by refusing to fight on their enemies' terms. Marcus managed a slightly strained smile. "I study how cultures solve impossible problems. Sometimes the solution is accepting you can't solve the problem as stated, and solving a different problem instead." "Show me," Caravel said, and her tone held genuine interest now. Second scenario, more complex variables. Let's see if your asymmetric thinking adapts. The second scenario was worse. Marcus commanded defense of a colony against invasion force with overwhelming superiority in every category. His forces were outnumbered 5-1, out-equipped in technology, and had explicit orders to protect civilian population, while defending against enemy that had no such constraints. This wasn't a scenario about winning. This was a scenario about how you chose to lose. Marcus knew this type of scenario from his academic research. It was testing moral choices under impossible pressure, seeing whether commanders would sacrifice civilians to achieve military objectives or accept military defeat to protect civilians. Caravel was evaluating not just his strategic thinking, but his character, when strategy alone wasn't sufficient. He made his choice quickly, issuing commands that prioritized civilian evacuation and safety over military objectives. His forces fought defensive actions designed to buy time rather than achieve victory, accepting losses to ensure civilian transports escaped. When enemy forces inevitably overwhelmed his positions, they captured a colony that had been successfully evacuated. Military defeat, strategic failure by traditional metrics, but every civilian survived. "You lost," Caravel said neutrally. "I protected what mattered," Marcus responded. "Military victory at the cost of civilian casualties isn't victory by any ethical framework I recognize. I'd rather lose with honor than win through atrocity. Even knowing your warriors died for retreat rather than victory, especially knowing that warriors choose to fight, civilians don't. Protecting those who can't protect themselves is exactly what military force should exist for." He met Caravel's eyes directly. "If the scenario punishes me for that choice, then your scenarios value things I don't agree with valuing." Caravel was quiet for a long moment, then something in her posture relaxed. "The scenario doesn't punish that choice. The scenario reveals whether you possess the character our bloodline requires. Warriors who sacrifice civilians for tactical advantage failed this trial regardless of whether they achieve military objectives. You passed." She moved to configure the third scenario, and Marcus noticed her movement suggested something that might have been respect. Final scenario: maximum complexity, multiple competing objectives, insufficient resources, time pressure, an enemy that adapts to your strategies in real time. This is the trial where most warriors fail because they cannot manage cognitive load while maintaining strategic coherence. The third scenario was nightmare complexity, multiple theaters of operation, each requiring attention and resources, competing objectives that couldn't all be achieved simultaneously. Some would have to be sacrificed. Enemy forces that learned from his tactics and adapted their approach. Time pressure that prevented careful analysis of every decision. It was designed to overwhelm through sheer information density and decision paralysis. Marcus took one look at the scenario parameters and made a choice that surprised even himself. He immediately delegated command authority to his simulated subordinates, assigning each one specific theaters and objectives with broad guidance but tactical independence. Instead of trying to micromanage everything himself, he created a command structure that distributed cognitive load and allowed adaptation, without requiring his direct involvement in every decision. "You're not commanding," Caravel said, watching him set up delegation systems instead of issuing tactical orders. "I'm commanding the command structure," Marcus replied. "I can't process information fast enough to manage this complexity directly, but I can create systems that process information at distributed level and coordinate through shared strategic objectives. Humans figured out centuries ago that the best commanders don't try to control everything. They create organizations that function effectively even without constant oversight. He watched the simulation run with his distributed command structure, responding to developing situations faster than he could have managed individually. Some theaters succeeded, some failed, some achieved partial objectives. But the overall campaign remained coherent because everyone was operating from shared strategic framework, even when tactical situations varied wildly. When the simulation concluded, results were mixed. Neither complete victory nor total defeat, but something in between that suggested competent management of impossible complexity. Curavel studied the results for several minutes before speaking. "You didn't win. I didn't lose either," Marcus said. "I achieved acceptable outcomes across multiple competing objectives while managing complexity that would have overwhelmed centralized command. In organizational terms, that's success, even if it's not total victory." "You think like an academic, not a warrior," Curavel observed. "You approach military problems as systems management challenges rather than glory opportunities." "I am an academic, not a warrior," Marcus acknowledged. "I was never going to match Thicarian tactical genius on direct terms, so I used the advantages I actually have. Different perspective, different analytical frameworks, different definition of what constitutes success." Caravel moved to stand directly in front of him, her height difference even more noticeable in close proximity. "You failed to achieve victory by our traditional standards. You lost battles, accepted defeat, prioritized preservation over conquest." She paused, and her expression held something Marcus couldn't quite interpret. "And you demonstrated exactly what my mother claims to seek: intelligence that adapts rather than overwhelms, strategic thinking that acknowledges limitations and works within them, character that chooses honor over expedience, even when expedience offers tactical advantage." Her formal bearing relaxed slightly. "I approve your worthiness by intelligence measures, Dr. Chen. You think differently than we do, which is exactly what our bloodline may require. Genetic legacy benefits from diverse problem-solving approaches." "Does that mean I passed?" Marcus asked carefully. "It means you survived my trial with honor intact," Caravel said. "The other 2 trials remain. My sister Zaranis will test your courage tomorrow. Be prepared. She will push you to your physical limits and beyond. Strategic intelligence will not help you face what she designs." She walked toward the arena exit, then paused and looked back. "For what it's worth, your asymmetric warfare approach was genuinely clever. I've never seen anyone solve the first scenario that way. You surprised me, which doesn't happen often. That alone makes you interesting." She left and Marcus collapsed into the nearest seat, his brain exhausted from 3 hours of intense tactical simulation under evaluation by someone whose strategic brilliance was legendary. He'd survived day 1. 2 more trials remained, each designed to test qualities he wasn't certain he possessed. But he'd faced Caravel's intelligence tests and emerged with approval. That had to count for something, even if tomorrow involved facing Zarina's, the unconquerable in trials designed to test courage through direct confrontation with things that terrified him. Marcus was escorted back to his quarters where food waited, and he was informed he had the rest of the day to recover before dawn trials with the second princess. He ate mechanically while reviewing what little he knew about Zarina's trial methodology, knowing that strategic thinking wouldn't help when facing someone whose entire reputation was built on never being defeated in personal combat. He was going to be tested on courage. Real visceral courage that involved facing fear directly, rather than thinking around it cleverly. This was going to hurt. Dawn came too early again, though Marcus suspected dawn would feel too early regardless of how much sleep he'd gotten. His body was tired from yesterday's mental exhaustion, and his brain was already anticipating the physical challenges that Zarina's would undoubtedly inflict. The arena had been reconfigured overnight into something that looked like a combat training ground, merged with an obstacle course designed by someone with sadistic attention to detail. Princess Zarina stood in the center, wearing light combat armor, her bearing suggesting controlled violence and absolute confidence. She looked at Marcus with an expression that wasn't cruel or dismissive, just evaluative, like a craftsperson examining materials to determine their breaking point. "Dr. Chen," she said formally, "welcome to your second trial. I will test your courage through direct confrontation with fear and physical limits. I do not expect you to match my combat capability, You lack the training and physiology our warriors develop over decades. But I will evaluate how you respond when facing situations designed to terrify and overwhelm you. Whether you retreat, freeze, or continue despite knowing you cannot win." She gestured to the course behind her. "You will face 3 challenges of increasing intensity, each designed to push you beyond comfort into genuine fear, each requiring you to act despite that fear, rather than simply endure it. Courage is action despite terror, not absence of terror. Show me whether you possess courage or merely bravado." Marcus looked at the course and felt his survival instincts screaming warnings. The first section involved crossing an obstacle path suspended high above the arena floor with insufficient handholds and designed to shift unpredictably. The second section was shrouded in some kind of visual distortion field that prevented seeing what waited inside. The third section. Marcus couldn't see the third section clearly, but he could hear sounds coming from it that suggested large, aggressive things with teeth. "Begin when ready," Zorani said, "or retreat now if you prefer." No shame attaches to acknowledging fear and choosing safety over foolish persistence. Marcus could retreat, should retreat by any reasonable risk analysis. His academic research didn't require actually participating in warrior trials designed to break people much stronger than him. He could return to safe observation, write about this experience from comfortable distance, acknowledge that he'd proven whatever point he'd accidentally proven. His mouth, demonstrating that it had learned nothing from previous experience, said, "I'm ready." The first challenge was a test in managed terror. The suspended obstacle path shifted constantly, requiring continuous adaptation and balance, while Marcus's hindbrain screamed about the 30-foot drop below. He'd never been comfortable with heights, and this course seemed designed specifically to exploit that discomfort. But he moved forward anyway, forcing his body to follow his decisions even when every instinct said stopping was the reasonable choice. He fell twice, caught by safety systems that prevented actual injury, but didn't prevent the visceral terror of falling. Each time, he climbed back up and continued. Progress was slow, clumsy, nothing like the fluid grace the Akarian warriors would demonstrate, but he reached the end eventually, his hands shaking and his heart racing, but his body still functional. Zoranis watched without comment, her expression unreadable. The second challenge was worse, because Marcus couldn't see what he was facing. The visual distortion field meant entering blind, relying on other senses while his imagination filled the void with every possible threat. This was psychological warfare, forcing him to confront fears that existed primarily in his own mind rather than objective reality. He stepped into the field, and immediately his other senses were assaulted by sounds, smells, and tactile sensations designed to trigger fear responses. Things brushed past him in darkness. Sounds suggested large creatures moving nearby. His brain painted mental pictures of threats that might or might not actually exist. He kept moving forward, forcing himself to trust that this was a trial rather than actual combat, that Zoranis was testing courage rather than trying to kill him. His progress was halting, fearful, punctuated by moments where he froze, because his body refused to move toward perceived threats. But he didn't retreat, didn't turn back, just kept pushing forward despite terror, until he emerged from the distortion field on the other side, his whole body trembling, but still functional. "You're afraid," Zoranis observed, and it wasn't a question. "Terrified," Marcus confirmed, because lying about his emotional state seemed pointless when it was this obvious. But still moving forward. Why? "Because retreating feels worse than being afraid," Marcus said, which was the most honest answer he could give. "Because I said I'd face these trials, and I keep my commitments even when I really wish I hadn't made them. Because being afraid, but continuing anyway, is apparently how I'm built." Zoranis's expression might have shifted slightly toward something positive, but Marcus was too focused on not passing out from adrenaline to interpret Vicarian body language accurately. "Final challenge," she said, gesturing toward the third section where those concerning sounds were coming from. "This will test whether your courage survives when facing actual physical threat, rather than just psychological pressure." The third section contained creatures. Marcus didn't know what species they were, but they were large, aggressive, and very clear about wanting him to leave their territory immediately. This wasn't a test of combat skill. Marcus didn't have combat skill to test. This was a test of whether he could function while being actively threatened by things that could hurt him badly if they wanted to. Zorani stood at a control station, presumably ready to intervene if things went actually dangerous rather than just terrifying. But she wasn't intervening yet, which meant Marcus was expected to handle this himself somehow. He couldn't fight these creatures, couldn't overpower them or intimidate them. What he could do was think, even while afraid, and use his brain to avoid situations where physical confrontation became necessary. He moved carefully, watching the creatures' behavioral patterns, identifying their territorial markers and defensive postures. He approached problems like a xenobiologist rather than a warrior, understanding their behavior and working with it rather than against it. Progress was slow and required several retreats when he misjudged territorial boundaries, but he made it through eventually, reaching the far side of the section without getting mauled, because he'd been smart enough to avoid situations where mauling would occur. When Marcus emerged from the final section with an expression that Marcus still couldn't confidently interpret, "You were afraid," she said. "The entire time. I watched you shake, freeze, struggle to force your body forward despite terror. By traditional Thicarian standards, you demonstrated significant fear rather than courage." She paused, and something in her posture suggested respect. "And yet you continued. Every time you froze, you eventually moved forward. Every time you wanted to retreat, you found reasons to persist. You acknowledged fear openly, while refusing to let it control your decisions." Her voice held something that might have been approval. "That is true courage, Dr. Chen. Not the absence of fear, but action despite it. Not pretending you're not afraid, but being afraid and continuing anyway. Many warriors confuse fearlessness with courage. You demonstrate the difference." "I'm just really bad at backing down once I've committed to something," Marcus managed, still trying to process that he'd survived. "Stubbornness more than courage. Courage is often stubbornness by another name," Zarina observed. "The refusal to quit despite every reasonable justification for quitting. You possess that quality, even if you call it by different names." She moved toward the arena exit, then paused. "Tomorrow, you face Lyrazin. Her trial will be different, less physical, more philosophical. She will test your spirit and character. Be prepared for questions that have no comfortable answers." She left, and Marcus collapsed onto the arena floor, his body shaking with residual adrenaline, and his brain trying to process the fact that he just survived direct confrontation with his worst fears, because he was apparently too stubborn to do the sensible thing and retreat. 2 trials down, 1 remaining. He demonstrated intelligence that adapted to impossible problems, and courage that persisted despite overwhelming fear. Tomorrow, he'd face philosophical challenges from a warrior philosopher who evaluated character rather than just capability. Marcus dragged himself back to his quarters, accepted food and water from concerned attendants, and spent the rest of the day recovering from physical and psychological exhaustion. His body hurt in places he didn't know could hurt. His brain was foggy from adrenaline crash and stress, but he'd survived, and apparently earned approval from 2 warrior princesses who'd never been impressed by anyone before. That had to mean something. As evening fell, Marcus received a message requesting his presence at dinner with the royal family. He dragged himself into presentable condition and attended, finding himself seated near Queen Varana and her daughters, in an informal setting that suggested evaluation continued, even outside formal trials. "You survived," the Queen observed, which might have been congratulations or just statement of fact. "My daughters report that you demonstrate qualities worthy of consideration, intelligence that adapts, courage that persists. Tomorrow Lyrazin will complete your testing." "And then what happens?" Marcus asked, because his brain was too tired for diplomatic circumlocution. "Then we discover whether theoretical worthiness translates to actual compatibility," the Queen said. "Whether courage and intelligence matter enough to offset physical limitations, whether human qualities complement Thicarian genetics, or simply prove interesting but ultimately insufficient." She studied him with that same calculating intensity. "You have surprised me, Dr. Chen. I expected you to fail honorably and retreat. Instead, you persist through 2 trials, designed to break warriors much stronger than you. I am genuinely curious whether this represents exceptional character or merely exceptional stubbornness that hasn't realized when to quit." "Possibly both," Marcus admitted. "I'm not sure myself anymore." The dinner continued with surprisingly pleasant conversation. Kuraval asked detailed questions about his strategic thinking during the scenarios, genuinely interested in his asymmetric approach. Zoranis discussed fear and courage with philosophical depth that surprised Marcus. She wasn't just a warrior, she was a thinker who'd spent years contemplating what bravery actually meant. Even N engaged, though her questions were more oblique, exploring his perspectives on ethics and character through hypothetical scenarios that Marcus suspected were preparation for tomorrow's trial. By the time Marcus returned to his quarters, he was exhausted, but also strangely comfortable. The Queen's daughters were terrifying, but they were also fascinating. Brilliant minds combined with physical excellence, women who'd spent decades perfecting both martial capability and intellectual depth. If he'd encountered them as research subjects rather than as potential partners evaluating his worthiness, he'd have been thrilled to study their perspectives. As partners, that was more complicated than his academic training had prepared him for. Tomorrow was the final trial. Philosophy and character with Lyrazen, who would test whether his apparent courage and intelligence actually reflected genuine quality of spirit or just clever performance. Marcus tried to sleep, knowing he'd need mental clarity for whatever challenges awaited. But his dreams were full of suspended paths, darkness full of threats, and 3 warrior princesses, who'd somehow become less terrifying and more intriguing, over the course of 2 days facing trials designed to break him. Dawn of the 3rd day found Marcus in the arena again, though this time the space had been configured completely differently. Instead of tactical displays or obstacle courses, there was simply a comfortable seating area, with low tables and ambient lighting, designed for conversation rather than combat. Princess Lyrazen waited there, and unlike her sisters, she wore scholar's robes rather than armor. She looked younger than the other 2. Marcus knew she was the youngest daughter, but her eyes held the kind of depth that suggested she'd thought about things most people never considered. Dr. Chen, she greeted him formally. Welcome to your final trial. I will test your spirit and character through conversation and philosophical challenge. There is no physical component, no tactical simulation, or just questions and discussion. Some will be comfortable, most will not be. I will evaluate whether your apparent courage and intelligence reflect genuine strength of character or merely clever adaptation to immediate challenges. She gestured for him to sit, and Marcus took a seat across from her, more nervous about philosophical interrogation than he'd been about the previous physical and mental trials. At least with those, he'd understood the parameters. This felt open-ended, and potentially more revealing than he was comfortable with. Why did you come to Thykar Prime? Lyrazen asked, beginning with what seemed like a simple question. To study your culture for my doctoral dissertation. To understand how Thykarian society integrates martial excellence with philosophical depth and strategic sophistication. To learn from a civilization that solved problems my species still struggles with. That is your academic answer, Lyrazen said. Now tell me the real reason. Marcus paused, caught off guard by her immediate push past his prepared response. Because I was curious. Because different perspectives make us better at understanding our own limitations. Because I wanted to see whether ideals like honor and courage could actually function in practical civilization, or whether they were just theoretical concepts that failed under real-world pressure. And what did you discover? That your ideals mostly work, but create their own complications. Honor prevents certain kinds of corruption, but makes adaptation difficult. Martial excellence produces capable warriors, but potentially intimidates people into paralysis, like what happened with your mother's challenge. No system is perfect, but yours is more functional than most. Lyrazen nodded, her expression thoughtful. You observe from outside, which gives you perspective our people lack. Now tell me, when you stood in challenge space, was it truly courage, or simply momentum of the moment? If you could return to that instant with full knowledge of consequences, would you still step forward? Marcus thought carefully before answering. Honestly, probably not. If I'd understood what I was committing to, I'd have retreated. The fact that I'm here is partly accident, partly my inability to back down once I've said something, and partly the specific circumstances making retreat seem worse than persistence. That is remarkably honest, Lyrazen observed. Most warriors would claim they'd absolutely make the same choice again. You admit your courage is partly accident and stubbornness. Why? Because pretending otherwise would be lying, and lying about character during a character evaluation seems counterproductive. Marcus met her eyes directly. I'm afraid most of the time during these trials I survive through combination of intelligence, stubbornness, and luck. If that doesn't meet your standards for worthiness, I'd rather fail honestly than succeed through deception. Lyra Zen's expression shifted to something that might have been approval. That honesty is itself a form of courage. Most people protect their self-image even when honesty would serve them better. You acknowledge limitations and flaws without diminishing your actual achievements. She poured drinks for both of them from a vessel that Marcus didn't recognize. Next question. What do you fear most? Failing people who depend on me, Marcus answered after brief consideration. Losing people I care about because I made mistakes. Being responsible for harm I could have prevented. Those are the fears that drive most of my decisions, including the excessive caution your sister observed during yesterday's trial. You've lost people before. It wasn't a question. Yes. Research team on a previous assignment. Equipment failure I should have caught during safety checks. 3 people died because I was careless. Marcus's voice was steady, but the words cost him. That's why I volunteer for solo research postings now. Can't lose a team if you don't have a team. That is trauma response masquerading as practical strategy, Lirazan said gently. You isolate yourself to prevent repetition of past pain, yet you're here, engaging with my family, facing trials that require vulnerability and risk. Why accept this situation when it contradicts your protective patterns? Because your mother asked a question and no one else answered, and that felt worse than the risk of stepping forward, Marcus said. Because sometimes isolation becomes its own kind of harm because... He paused, surprised by his own honesty. Because your family is fascinating and terrifying, and I wanted to know you better, even if it meant risking vulnerability I've been avoiding. Lyra Zen watched him with those deep, thoughtful eyes. You're attracted to us. I'm academically interested and possibly emotionally invested in ways I'm still processing, Marcus corrected. Your intelligence challenges me. Your courage makes me want to be braver. Your existence contradicts assumptions about what warrior cultures can be. Whether that's attraction or admiration or something else, I'm not sure yet. Honest uncertainty is valuable, Lyra then observed. Most suitors approach with absolute certainty of their worthiness and desire. You approach with questions and acknowledgement of complexity. That suggests capacity for growth rather than static confidence. She refilled their drinks. What do you believe makes a life worth living? The question was deceptively simple, but contained philosophical depths Marcus could spend hours unpacking. He tried for concise honesty, connection, learning, and the sense that you're contributing something meaningful, relationships that make you better than you'd be alone, knowledge that expands your understanding, work that matters to someone beyond yourself. Those are the things that make life feel worthwhile, instead of just survival. And do you have those things? Sometimes. The learning and contribution parts, yes. Research provides both. The connection part, Marcus hesitated. That's what I've been avoiding. Hard to have meaningful relationships when you're deliberately keeping distance to prevent loss, which means I've been living only partial worthwhile life. And now I'm terrified and confused, and possibly making the worst decisions of my life, Marcus admitted, but also more connected to other people than I've been in years. Your family has somehow become people I care about despite meeting you 3 days ago. That's probably crisis bonding and I'll regret it later. But right now it feels like the kind of connection that makes life worthwhile. Lyra Zen was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Tell me about your research. What drives your study of cultures so different from your own? They talked for hours, the conversation ranging across philosophy, ethics, cultural anthropology, and the fundamental questions about what makes life meaningful. Marcus found himself discussing things he'd never articulated clearly before. His beliefs about connection and isolation, his struggles with trauma and risk aversion, his genuine fascination with how different species approached universal problems. Lyra Zen asked questions that pushed him to examine assumptions and articulate positions he'd never fully thought through. The conversation was more intensive than any of his doctoral examinations, but also more rewarding. She was brilliant in ways that had nothing to do with combat capability, and everything to do with deep thinking about difficult questions. By the time afternoon light filtered through the arena's high windows, Marcus felt like he'd been through intellectual workout that left him exhausted, but also strangely energized. Final question, Lyra Zen said as their long conversation approached conclusion. Why are you truly here? Not the accident, not the stubbornness, not the momentum. At your core, what drove you to accept these trials when retreat was available? Marcus thought carefully, reaching for honesty that went deeper than convenient explanations. Because being safe and isolated was slowly killing me, and facing your trials, as terrifying as they are, makes me feel alive again. Because your family challenged me to be braver and smarter and more honest than I've been in years. Because he met her eyes directly. Because I'm tired of protecting myself from loss by refusing to have anything worth losing. Your mother asked for someone brave enough to face her daughters. Maybe I'm not that person by traditional measures, but I want to be. I want to be brave enough to risk connection, even when connection means vulnerability. Lyra Zen stood, moving around the table to stand before him. You have answered every question with honesty that cost you. You acknowledged fears and flaws without diminishing yourself. You demonstrated the kind of spirit that cannot be trained or faked. The capacity for genuine self-reflection and growth. Her formal bearing softened slightly. I approve your worthiness by character measures, Dr. Chen. You possess strength of spirit that our bloodline requires. Not the kind that pretends to be fearless, but the kind that acts despite fear. Not the kind that claims perfection, but the kind that acknowledges flaws while striving for improvement. That is the character that produces strong descendants, not genetically, but ethically. She moved toward the arena exit, then paused. Tonight, my mother will announce her judgment. You have passed all 3 trials with approval from each daughter, but final decision rests with her. Whether your demonstrated qualities outweigh your physical limitations, whether human courage complements the Kyrian genetics. We will learn whether this experiment succeeds or whether you have simply provided fascinating data for your dissertation. She left, and Marcus sat alone in the conversation space, emotionally drained, but also oddly peaceful. He'd survived 3 trials designed to test intelligence, courage, and character. He'd earned approval from 3 warrior princesses who'd never been impressed by anyone before. Whether that translated to actual acceptance remained to be seen. But he'd faced the challenges with honesty and persistence, and that had to count for something. That evening, Marcus was summoned to the grand arena where the entire court had assembled again. Queen Varana stood on her platform, her daughters arranged beside her, and the atmosphere held the kind of formal gravity that suggested important announcements were imminent. Dr. Marcus Chen, the Queen's voice carried clearly across the vast space. You have completed 3 trials designed to test qualities essential to our bloodline: intelligence to adapt and think strategically, courage to act despite overwhelming fear, spirit to maintain character under pressure. My daughters report that you demonstrated all 3 qualities, though not in traditional Thicarian manner. She paused and the court waited in absolute silence. You failed by many conventional standards. You lost military scenarios, displayed obvious fear, acknowledged limitations and flaws. By traditional measures, you are unsuitable, physically weaker, lacking combat capability, too small to produce offspring that match our genetic standards. The Queen's gaze swept across the assembled court, then returned to Marcus. And yet you demonstrated something none of our own warriors showed when I issued my challenge. You stepped forward despite knowing you were outmatched. You persisted through trials designed to break you. You answered every test with honesty rather than bravado. You treated my daughters as people to understand rather than prizes to win. Her expression held something Marcus couldn't quite interpret. Perhaps this is exactly what our bloodline requires. Not more warriors who are too proud or too intimidated to approach, but someone who combines courage with humility, intelligence with adaptability, strength of character with capacity for growth. These are qualities that matter regardless of physical limitations. She made her announcement with formal authority. I accept Marcus Chen as worthy of courtship with my daughters, not as final commitment, that requires their individual choice and his acceptance, but as recognition that human courage and intelligence offer valuable complement to Thicarian excellence. We will discover whether theoretical compatibility translates to actual partnership. The court erupted in mixed reactions, some approving, some skeptical, some simply stunned that this unprecedented situation was continuing beyond trials. Marcus stood frozen, trying to process that he'd apparently been approved for courting alien warrior princesses, because his stubbornness and excessive honesty demonstrated character the Queen valued. You may accept or decline this offer, Queen Varana said, addressing Marcus directly now. No obligation attaches to having survived the trials. You may return to your research with honor and gratitude for providing valuable demonstration to our people, or you may explore whether compatibility exists between human and Thicarian perspectives, whether connection is possible across species and cultural differences. Marcus looked at the queen's daughters, Curaval with her strategic brilliance and approving assessment, Zoranes with her warrior's honor and respect for courage however expressed, Lyra Zine with her philosophical depth and gentle evaluation of his character. 3 women who were terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. 3 people he'd somehow come to care about despite circumstances that should have kept everything professional and distant. His academic training said this was unprecedented research opportunity. His survival instincts said this was definitely going to complicate his life in impossible ways. His heart said these women were worth the complication and risk. Marcus did what he'd been doing for 3 days. He refused the safe retreat. "I accept," he said clearly. "I want to explore whether compatibility exists, whether courage matters more than genetics, whether connection is possible despite all the excellent reasons it shouldn't be." Queen Vorana smiled, genuinely smiled in a way that transformed her entire presence. "Then let us discover what happens when human stubborn courage meets Thicarian excellence, whether this produces strong grandchildren or simply produces valuable friendships. Either way, you have taught my people an important lesson about the nature of bravery."